Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. Scott gave a slightly sanitized version of my move to the Davenant board. How it actually happened was around about 15 months ago. I was contacted and asked if I would be a sort of independent advisor on the search for a new president. I agreed to that, and then about 2 weeks later, Scott emailed me and said I'd been elected to the board. So it was somewhat of a shock, but nonetheless a pleasure. I've enjoyed being connected with the Davenant Institute for some years now, and enjoyed the material that Davenant has produced, enjoyed the convivium I attended, and also perhaps my favorite memory was the round table I did with Peter Leithart maybe 10 years ago. Peter's become a friend. Always glad that Peter was in a different denomination to me, because I felt we would be on the opposite side of a lot of the big debates going on. But that perhaps is my favorite memory. Biola University with Fred Sanders and Peter Leithart. So it's a pleasure to be speaking to you this evening. When Wyatt contacted me, I asked him, what do you want me to speak on? And he said, expressive individualism. My heart fell. I think I've done over 200 podcasts on that, and probably given an equal number of lectures on it over the last 4 years, to the point where I would genuinely describe myself as bored with my own work on that front. What I want to do this evening is really, I won't say critique myself, but offer some thoughts as a work in progress about things that I neglected or missed in my earlier treatment of expressive individualism. The book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, came out in, I think, 2020. The manuscript was pretty much completed by the beginning of 2019. A lot of things have happened in the 5 years since then that have made me think and reflect, and not, I think, substantially change anything I said, but certainly wish to supplement it and to ask some new questions. So that's what I want to do this evening. Tomorrow I'm going to return to my first love. I'm often described as a theologian. I have no theological qualifications whatsoever. I did an MA in Classics at the University of Cambridge, and then I did a PhD in Reformation history, intellectual history, at the University of Aberdeen. I consider myself to be an intellectual historian. What I want to do tomorrow is take an intellectual historian's approach to what is probably the most famous text on Christian liberty, written in the 16th century, and that is Martin Luther's Freedom of the Christian Man. And do what I love doing best, and that's setting that text in the context of Luther's life. One of the things I love about Luther is that even though he never wrote a systematic theology, and most, if not all, of his theological treatises are occasional, he was a remarkably consistent thinker. And you can take almost any major text he wrote and explore the rest of his life and theology from that text. And that's what I want to do tomorrow, relative to that work and the development of Protestant pastoral practice in Lutheranism in the 16th century. Fun for me, it might be totally tedious for you. I'm leaving in the afternoon, so I don't care. You have little time to complain. The question that's bugged me since I published the book on expressive individualism has been this: did it have to be this way? Is it the case that if you have a culture built around a notion of expressive individualism, did it have to end up in quite the, to use loaded language about it, quite the depraved way that it has done? And I'm increasingly persuaded that the answer is yes. That at the heart of expressive individualism there is an iconoclastic, or to use even stronger language perhaps, a desecrational aspect. That's what I want to explore tonight. And I think that that is key because, if the problem of human beings is that we're desecrated, the answer ultimately has to be that we need to be consecrated. So although I won't get to the answer tonight, I would like you to sort of be thinking along those lines as I address this issue. Generally, discussions of freedom tend to operate around, are we talking about freedom from or freedom for? I would suggest that expressive individualism can really be characterized in the modern age as a freedom to transgress. That's where it goes, I think, for reasons that I will talk about. And that means, of course, that it has, we might say, the gravity of culture, or the gravity of fallen human psychology behind it. Transgression is fun. Augustine understands that. I never cease to find new things in Augustine's Confessions, and time and again I return to that passage in Book 2, where he narrates in painful detail the crime where he steals the pears. There are so many literary and theological facets to that it is a beautiful, if not somewhat terrifying passage at the same time. And of course, Freud, one of the great, we might say, thinkers of modernity, also understands that transgression and transgressive behavior is fun and entertaining. Now, as a theologian, I'm not a theologian, but if I were, I might come at this point and say, so, yeah, everything in human nature, fallen human nature, points us towards transgression. So what is new about the modern age? What does expressive individualism have to add to this? Well, I want to argue that the material conditions that gave rise to expressive individualism have actually enabled transgression in ways that were previously unimaginable. Yeah, there's a sense in which human beings are as sinful today as they were in the year 500. But our capacity for expressing that in destructive ways is much greater today. Okay, I'm going to get to there at some point. First of all, I want to just do a sort of rerun of my arguments about expressive individualism, but looking at them from a slightly different angle. In the book, I tell an intellectual history. My undergraduate history supervisor, Paul Cartledge at the University of Cambridge, who went on to write my doctoral reference, card-carrying Marxist, I think would have been ashamed of my failure really to address the material conditions in which these ideas were taking root. So let's think a little bit about the material conditions that have given birth to modern notions of selfhood. Typically do this in my class with the students by engaging in a thought experiment. I grew up in a very rural part of the United Kingdom, Gloucestershire, over in the Cotswolds. I'll be there visiting my mother in 4 weeks' time, and I look out of the window of her cottage. I will see exactly the same skyline that I saw when I was growing up. Rural community, very little changes, including the people. Just as an aside, my niece, my beloved niece, got married a few years ago, went over to go to her wedding. She made the fatal mistake of getting one of her groom's Gloucestershire pals to do the photography. Fundamental error. It's like being in Arkansas and hiring the local garage mechanic to do your wedding photographs. I got a desperate email from my mother about 3 weeks later. The photographer, classic Gloucestershire man, had photographed everybody at the wedding except for one person. And it is as absolutely bad as most of you are imagining at this point. The bride did not feature in any of the wedding photographs. Luckily, husband, her beloved uncle, had taken some on his phone, so it was not a complete bust. I gather this guy has since moved to Sweden, which is a good move on his part. My niece was not very happy with him. Had he stayed in the UK, I think plastic surgery would probably have been important as he went into hiding. But if we were to go back some centuries in Gloucestershire, think about the material conditions in, say, the 12th century in my village in Gloucestershire. Born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Social mobility, virtually unknown. As a child, you would never have had to wrestle with the question of what you were going to do when you grew up. Your end was determined by your beginning. Geographically, your world would have been limited. Best guess in the 12th century is, an exceptional person might have traveled 40 miles away from their place of birth at some point in their life. If you took your place of birth and drew a circle of an 80-mile diameter, that would be your entire world. Time, too, would have great authority. Seasons had a fixed rhythm. Your life was tied to the rhythm of the seasons. You were a farmer or a peasant. You had to know what to do at what point in the year. The liturgical calendar of the church would have been patterned around that agrarian rhythm of time. So you have that interesting reinforcement of the agrarian nature of life and the religious nature of life. There would have been no religious choice. Religion could not possibly be a consumer commodity because there was only one church in town. There was fixed hierarchy. There was fixed status. Communal existence was reinforced at every point. Think of it. Entertainment, such as it was, would always have been live, active, and communal. You couldn't switch on a screen. One of the things I read with the students in class each year is Robert Burns' wonderful poem, The Cotter's Saturday Night. Burns was a godless individual, but he wrote what is probably the most beautiful literary description of family devotions anywhere in literature. And in that poem, the family gather around the fireplace. And I use that as an example with the students. Say, okay, what is the focal point of the living room today? It is the television screen. What do television screens do? They separate us from each other even as we sit together. Fireplace brought people together. Music was a communal production. Music, I think, only existed originally for communal reasons. Now, of course, the way most of us, I would say, consume music is individually. When I get on the plane tomorrow, it'll be a great relief to me when the person next to me puts their earbuds in, because I'm an introvert, and it means they're not going to engage me in conversation. I don't have to pretend to be interested in them. I can just get on with reading my book. The world itself would have possessed solidity and stability. Little change to landscape, little change to architecture, little change to social organization. In short, lives in the 12th century would be marked by deep stability, shaped by the dependencies and obligations that were simply, as far as anyone could see, the order of nature, the way things had always been and the way things had to be. The question of identity, I think, in the 12th century was pretty easy. To ask anybody who they were or what they were for would have had a pretty straightforward answer. Who are you? I'm the son of X. I live in village Y. I'm a peasant. What are you for? What ends do you have? I plow the fields. I scatter seed. I harvest the crops for my community. And identity would also have been religious to some degree. Key moments in life, baptism, marriage, death, would be marked by public, communal, religious rituals at the one available church, and the rhythm of time would be calibrated by the liturgical calendar. Resistance and transgression in such contexts was very hard, if not impossible. I joke with the students that we have a name for farmers who attempt to defy the rhythm of the seasons: dead farmers. If you plow the fields and scatter the seed and attempt to harvest at wrong points in the year, you will starve to death. Resistance is futile. Contrast that to modernity. Think of time. When I used to teach Reformation, one of the events that I would zero in on, and still do this occasionally in class, one of the most important, I think, and emblematic events of the Reformation takes place in 1522 in Zurich, when Christoph Froschauer, the great printer of Zurich, and printers were the unsung heroes or villains of the Reformation, depending on your perspective. Christoph Froschauer, during the Lenten fast, called his men together, cooked up a plate of sausages and ate them. breaking the Lenten fast. Huldrych Zwingli, the great reformer of Zurich, was present, though in his account of the event made it clear, just to sort of cover his own back, that he did not partake of the sausages. It sounds like a trivial event, but think about it. The way I present this in class is this. This is the moment at which the old world meets the new world, and the old world loses decisively. The seasons will no longer have the authority they used to have. In an economy built around industrial production, the rhythm of the seasons becomes less and less and less significant. The power of time becomes less and less significant. It fascinates me how a number of thinkers of modernity wrestle with what has happened to time in modernity. I think of the Marxist. Even my wife can't stand listening to me. She's had enough. There she goes. Not bad. I think she lasted 10 minutes this time, so that's pretty good. I think of Walter Benjamin, the sort of strange associate, mystical associate of the early Frankfurt School, with his concept of homogeneous empty time, and what happens to our experience of time when every day is kind of the same in a highly bureaucratized or industrialized world. I often wondered exactly what is Benjamin getting at there. And then COVID happened. And I think about the period of time that I only taught online for 6 weeks as it happens. Grove went back to in-person teaching as soon as we possibly could, which was great. But think of those weeks or months when we were basically confined to our houses and didn't see anybody. I look back on that and I have no real consciousness of the passage of time at that point. Didn't see my mother for 3 years. That's a long time. When your mum's in her 80s, 3 years is a long time not to see her. And yet I have no conception of the length of time when I think back on it. I think that is what Benjamin is getting at. I've been rereading Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain recently. I consider that to be, I think, the most brilliant analysis of the pathologies of modernity ever put into novelistic form. And I was struck this time, I'd never noticed it before, but it's there on every other page. How man wrestles with what does the passage and the rhythm of time mean? Even down to the structure of the work, where the first 3 weeks or so take a lot of text. And then the next sort of 6 years, 49 weeks take up proportionally much less text. Stuck in a hospital, time becomes just empty. The loss of the religious rhythm is fascinating. And I think as time loses its religious rhythm, that has to have an impact on how we think of ourselves, think of space. I traveled yesterday, got the plane, flew to Charlotte, did a more epic journey in the space of an hour and a half than almost anybody would ever have done in the 12th century. How I conceptualize space is very different. In fact, having moved to America, I conceptualize space very differently now. Growing up in England, if it's a 200-mile journey, man, you need a week's rest before you go back. I remember my wife and I were first here in 1996, and we invited to a church picnic, and I looked it up on the map. It was 120 miles away. I said, what kind of lunatic goes 120 miles for a church picnic? That's like the width of the country or something. Space has come to mean something very, very different. Though I have to say, driving here this evening, I suspect I moved slower than the average person would have moved in the 12th century. It has not been an unequivocal benefit. Economies. Think of the way that economies change how we think about ourselves, even the skill set. I've said this many times. I'm close enough to retirement now, just a few years away, approaching 60, looking to 65 to get out. Don't have to learn another software package, because if they drop another software package on me, I'm close enough to retirement not to have to bother learning it, and by the time they fired me, I'll be gone anyway. Software packages technology favors the young. It reshapes the relationship between generations. I have to learn from my sons, and in a few years' time, I guess, as she grows up, from my granddaughter, how to handle technology. Whereas in the 12th century, it would always have been in the other direction. Mass transport, and above all, I think, transformative technology play into this. It struck early in Goethe's play Faust. Mephistopheles, in one of his first meetings with the doctor, tempts Faust in the following way. He says this: "My dear sir, you're looking at things in a conventional way. We must do better than that, or the joys of life will escape us. Hang it! You have your hands and feet. You have a headpiece and a codpiece. And anything else you can enjoy is yours, isn't it? If I can afford a coach and six, isn't their energy mine? I can ride round as proudly as if I had 24 legs." The kind of technologies that we now have, which mediate the whole of life, are transforming how we think about ourselves in totality. I was drawing this example the other day with somebody saying, a toothbrush. You use a toothbrush to brush your teeth. It does that one thing. You've got a smartphone. It mediates everything. Your whole life is transformed by a smartphone. What it means to be human is completely transformed by a smartphone in the way that it is not transformed by a toothbrush. All of this, I think, has obvious relevance to the destabilizing of the world and of our experience of the world in modernity. I would suggest that today, continual convulsive change, in contrast to stability, is the order of the day. I can think of no better words, actually, to express this than those used by Engels and Marx in the Communist Manifesto. Writing in 1848, they say this: "Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, all those 12th century stabilities, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify." And then my favorite line in the entire manifesto: "All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face, with sober senses, his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." If that was true in 1848, how much more true is it today? Technology, I would suggest, overwhelms any notion of nature today. Fascinated by the book A Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, two great early critical theorists. What fascinates me is it's a book about the relationship between human beings and nature. And it never defines nature. Because I think, as good Hegelians, Adorno and Horkheimer knew, they couldn't do that. The technology to which we have access constantly changes and revolutionizes a notion of nature, of what it means to be human. Again, another German thinker, Heidegger, makes this striking comment about technology and its impact on what it means to be human. Writing, he's trying to rehabilitate himself in the 1950s after his association with the Nazis in Germany in the 30s and 40s. He goes on a sort of lecture spree, and one of these famous lectures is the question concerning technology. Writing, of course, in the wake of the Second World War, the advent of atomic weapons, he says this: "The threat to man does not come in the first instance from the potentially lethal machines and apparatus of technology." We might say weapons of mass destruction. "The actual threat has already affected man in his essence. The rule of inframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth." What he's saying there is the real threat to technology comes from the fact that it overwhelms who we actually are in a profound way. We see that a little bit with Marx. Marx is aware in the Communist Manifesto that the rise of industrialized labor will have a significant impact on how the relationship between men and women is construed. In 12th century Gloucestershire, if you're going to be a blacksmith, you've got to be big and strong. On average, men are going to be bigger and stronger than women. So typically, your men are going to be blacksmiths and warriors. Joan of Arc, of course, is something of an exception. But we know about Joan of Arc precisely because she is an exception. Marx spots that actually technology is going to change that. The significance of the body for who we are is going to be transformed. We see this in transhumanism today, and if there's one thing that I really missed in my 2020 book, it's the connection between transgenderism and transhumanism. I treated transgenderism really as part of the LGBTQ movement, which it is politically. I think philosophically, though, it is to be distinguished, at least from the L, the G, and the B, not so much from the Q. Transgenderism is really a species of transhumanism. Here's how the Transhumanist Manifesto begins. This Transhumanist Manifesto challenges the human condition. This condition asserts that aging is a disease, augmentation and enhancement of the human body and brain are essential to prevail, and that well-being is essential to prosper within safe and healthy environments. The manifesto, I think, correctly identifies the human condition as one of limitations, but it sees these limits not as something to be accepted or embraced, but as problems to be solved. We might summarize and say that in sum, the social imaginary, that way that people imagined the world in the year 1200, was one where it was intuitive to think of the world as a fixed place, temporally, spatially, and of oneself as fixed within it. To answer the question, who am I, would have been easy, for it involved simply locating myself within a solid, unchanging social world. My limits, my obligations, my ends, all given to me. None of that applies today. All of that is challengeable and resistible. That, I think, provides the material circumstances in which expressive individualism, this emphasis upon inner feelings as definitive of who I am, as opposed to outward physical circumstances, can become very, very plausible. It is interesting that in the 16th century, as religious authority is being smashed by the Reformation and by the printing press in a kind of pincer action, we see the rise of the first person. We see it theologically with Luther. We see it literarily with Montaigne. I'm not a Montaigne scholar. A friend of mine who specializes in Montaigne tells me that Montaigne uses the first person singular disproportionately compared to any previous writer. He bursts onto the scene as the man of the first person at round about the same time that the Reformation is happening. And we might add, what is it in Catholicism that sort of rehabilitates Catholicism in the 16th century? It's the Jesuits. Jesuit piety is a remarkably first-person kind of piety in many ways. That tension between the external world and the individual subject that we see manifesting itself in the 16th century will only become more pungent and powerful in subsequent centuries. How does it tilt us towards transgression? Well, I'd say one obvious way is this. Expressive individualism, the idea that I am who I am inside and not who society tells me I am, is always going to set itself up as hostile to the wider culture. It involves an inherently critical position towards the wider culture. It's going to incline me to suspect that society is always trying to squeeze us into its mold and make us inauthentic. It's going to make religion less plausible because, of course, the grand culprit in Western culture of this, up to the 16th century, is Christianity. And it will provide fertile soil for the emergence in the 19th century of an interesting development, and that is of the transgressor as hero. indebted to the work of literary critic Maya Steppenberg, who points out that she highlights Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, I'm sure there are others, as making an interesting shift in the 19th century from what she calls a moral category to an aesthetic category in terms of literary heroes. That we move from, you might say, paragons or examples of virtue to examples of transgressors. At the board meeting today, Robin at some point referred to Jane Austen as the great Anglican virtue theorist or some such term. I made a note of it, and I thought I'd mention that this evening. Compare a Jane Austen novel to a Dostoevsky novel. Okay, Dostoevsky allows his villains redemption at the end. But that's not why we read the books. We read the books for the villainy, I think, not so much the redemption. It's Nietzsche who philosophically spots what is going on in the 19th century, puts his finger on it. In his great Parable of the Madman, he puts these words in the madman's mouth. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Remember, he's addressing at this point the polite Enlightenment atheists, the Richard Dawkins and the Steven Pinkers, who are hanging around in the town square. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves, and this is the key line, I think, must we ourselves not become gods to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Bombastic words in the gay science in the late 19th century, but I think they characterize much of what goes on in modern Western culture today. Don't forget that at the end of that passage, the madman, nobody will listen to him. He drops his lantern and he says, I've come too early. Thunder takes time after the bolt of lightning. The light has to travel from the stars to reach us. My hour is not yet. When I read that, think of Nietzsche's comment in Ecce Homo, when he says, one day my name will be associated with the greatest of deeds. I am no man. I am dynamite. Remarkable. When he went mad in 1889, I think I'm right in saying that only one lecture had ever been given on his philosophy in the whole of Europe. And yet his fingerprints lie on every humanities curriculum in the West today, by and large. Stunning, stunningly predictive. For Nietzsche, for the expressive individual, we might say, to be authentic, he has to shatter the old moral codes. That's why Nietzsche liked Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's anti-hero, Rodion Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment. Remember, the rather delightful police chief gets on to him early because he happens to have read the philosophical journal that Raskolnikov wrote, that little essay on crime in it, where he argued that the men who belonged to a higher order were not answerable to the same moral codes as everybody else and could indeed demonstrate their superiority by transgressing those codes. Dostoevsky, fascinated by transgressive figures, was struck by this, his comment in Notes from a Dead House, his semi-fictionalized, semi-autobiographical reflections on his time spent in a Siberian prison. And he offers in that work pen portraits of different criminals that he meets in his time there. And one of them is an aristocratic fellow, very polite, very urbane, and Dostoevsky discovers that he's what we would now call a serial killer. And he's fascinated by, how does this urbane guy, why is he a serial killer? And he offers this very astute analysis. The first man he killed, he says, was an oppressor, an enemy. That is a crime, but understandable. He had a reason. But then he kills not an enemy, but the first man he meets. Kills him for fun, for a rude word, for a glance, for a trifle, or simply, out of my way, don't cross me, I'm coming. It's as if the man is drunk and he's in a feverish delirium. It's as if, having leapt over a line that was sacred, he begins to admire the fact that nothing is holy for him anymore. As if he feels an urge to leap over all legality and authority at once, and to revel in the most boundless and unbridled freedom, to revel in this thrill of horror, which it is impossible for him not to fear. Thomas Mann has Madame Chauchat say a similar thing in The Magic Mountain. It seems to us, she says, that one ought not to search for morality in virtue, which is to say in reason, in discipline, in good behavior, in respectability, but in just the opposite. I would say in sin, in abandoning oneself to danger, to whatever can harm or destroy us. I was thinking of this week because one of the fascinating aspects of modernity, of course, is that old values are overturned for reasons that are not applied to the new values. There was a stained glass window unveiled in Belfast City Hall about 2 weeks ago. Growing up in the UK, as I did, I'm sure Alistair can comment on Belfast, Northern Ireland, bastion of religious conservatism. Stained glass window unveiled 3 weeks ago. And I'm going to quote, so I don't usually use this term in lectures, particularly when there are kids present, but I'm going to quote what it says on this stained glass window. The stained glass window it's a pride window, and it has a young man with a white T-shirt on it, and the T-shirt is emblazoned with the phrase, "Save sodomy from Ulster." Fascinating. I commented to somebody recently, I can't watch, and I love those. In terms of music, I'm a Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett man. In terms of movies, it's got to be black and white for it to be really good, or involve samurai. I kind of like samurai movies, but by and large, it's got to be black and white. 13 Assassins, if you haven't seen it, it's worth to die for. I can't watch a Humphrey Bogart movie now without some warning at the start that there's going to be a scene of graphic smoking involved somewhere. And it's a sort of, smoking, I understand it's bad for you. I smoke a pipe maybe twice a year. It feels pretty good, I have to say, when I do it just twice a year. But smoking's bad for you. But so is anal sex. You don't have to take my word for that. If you dig around on government health sites, you can find the health statistics related to disproportionate number of people who develop cancer as a result of that particular activity. What fascinates me is the health criterion applies to the old values, but not to the new values. That tells you that what's going on here is not public health policy. It's crossing a line that was once deemed sacred. Because our parents thought smoking was a God-given right, so let us take it from them. Let us break that sacred thing. And let us glory in that which was once considered foul and vile. It's that psychological inconsistency that is so fascinating. And again, I think Nietzsche nails it. Nietzsche knew who the enemy was. He says this, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "Whoever must be a creator in good and evil, truly he must first be an annihilator and break values." And he clarifies exactly what he means in Ecce Homo. There's some debate about Ecce Homo because it's one of those books that was published after he'd gone mad when his rather unpleasant sister Elizabeth was in charge of his literary remains. But he makes this comment, and it certainly sounds like Nietzsche to me. Fundamentally, he says, my term immoralist involves two negations. For one, I negate a type of man that has so far been considered supreme, the good, the benevolent, the beneficent. And then I negate a type of morality that has become prevalent and predominant as morality itself, the morality of decadence, or more concretely, Christian morality. To recast this in terms of expressive individualism, which I did not do in my book, but I'm going to do here, The authentic person is the one who has the courage to act on his desires in a manner that contradicts the moral framework imposed upon him by society. Specifically, the ideal man, or to use Nietzsche's own term, the overman, is the desecrator, the one who crosses sacred moral boundaries. That's why I've thought of Oscar Wilde seems to me to be Nietzsche, the great sexual outlaw of the late 19th century. He came too early. The English establishment destroyed him because of it. But I'm always struck by that comment he writes in his famous essay De Profundis, written from prison to his gay lover. Most people, he says, are other people. Their thoughts are someone else's opinions. Their lives are mimicry. Their passions are quotation. How do you know that you're a genuine person? How do you know who you are in our modern world? You transgress. You transgress. And what, of course, was an elite game on top of Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, or batted around by the Bloomsbury Group in the Edwardian era, has migrated into pop culture at large. Marlon Brando in The Wild One and James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, down to Chigurh in No Country for Old Men, the amoral anti-hero has emerged as a central figure in Western culture, defined by rebellion against social and sacred norms. Summed up nicely, I think, in that famous exchange in The Wild One, where a girl asks Brando's character, "Hey Johnny, what are you rebelling against?" To which Brando gives the laconic but eloquent reply, "What have you got?" Adolescent rebellion is the order of the day. I might even say, I think, social media. Talked about media technology as reshaping us. I think we might say, the very economy of social media incentivizes this. You're not going to build your social media following by being nice and polite about people you disagree with or maintaining the status quo. You're going to build your social media following by constantly crossing boundaries. I don't do social media. How on earth I ended up on somebody's list of social media enemies recently, I have no idea how that took place. Twice, actually. Somebody said to me, "That's just how evil you are. You don't do social media, but you're so evil, you're twice as dangerous as anybody else on it." I don't do it, but it's been interesting to me seeing, sadly, some former friends and students, the path they've gone down on social media, with the constant need to outdo themselves in terms of transgressing those boundaries. That's the problem, of course, of modernity, is that as soon as you have a boundary, it's ripe for transgression. It's why I think theoretically everything will ultimately end up with queer theory. Practically it may not end up that way. Societies have the ability to pull back from destruction. Somebody said to me recently, are we going to pull back from destruction or self-destruct? And I said, well, societies do both. And he said, well, how do we know which is which? And I say, they do one or the other. Either you pull back or you self-destruct. There's no real way of predicting it. Maybe we'll pull back. But if things proceed as they are, then I think queer theory becomes the default. The war against all categories becomes the default. And queer theory has an interesting ally in transhumanism on that front. I think technologically, transhumanism is a kind of practical queer theory in the way that it destroys all stable categories. All bad news, my lecture, I'm afraid, but I wanted to supplement the bad news I gave you in the book. What practical lessons would I draw from this? Well, I would just leave with this 30-second summary. I would say, if the problem is desecration, if the problem is the transgression of sacred boundaries, we need some way of re-establishing sacred boundaries. And that's where my Christian theology kicks in, because I think God has a tool for doing that. It's called the church. Its weapons are the word and sacrament. It worked in the ancient church, the ancient world, and I earnestly believe it can work today. That is not an excuse for acquiescence to the status quo. I got involved in this stuff because of actions relative to the local school board that I was pulled into in 2015, 2016. My son took quite a gentle but courageous stand at the university he was at in the track team. He was a D1 track runner, and the track team were asked to wear rainbow armbands, and he declined. And he asked me what arguments he should give, and I said, tell him it's a matter of freedom of speech. You respect their right to wear the armband, but you ask them to respect your right not to do so. That worked in 2014. I don't think it would work today. That actually worked in 2014. But then a month or two later, I got a note from somebody I didn't know saying, would you join me in mounting opposition to trans bathroom policy in the school district? And I remember thinking, if my son can make a stand, I can make a stand. And hey, now's as good a time to get the house firebombed as any. We got the insurance up to date. The shocking thing to me about that, though, was this. Not only was my house not firebombed, I couldn't get anybody to pay any attention. Good, ordinary people had no idea what was coming down the pike at that point. So what I'm saying now is it's not an excuse for doing nothing, far from it. But it is an appeal to prioritize the church in our response. I will break there. Tomorrow I'm going to be on the much more fun territory as far as I'm concerned of Martin Luther. I get kind of tired of giving lectures as to why men can't be women. It'd be good to get back to the 16th century. My wife never came back.
I did notice that.
She's got the car keys as well.
Yeah, that'll be a problem. Well, thank you for only giving us bad news. That was quite amazing. You had some interesting one-liners. We have a short amount of time for clarifying questions. And then if you have more complex ones, save those for tomorrow. We're going to do a panel with Carl and Kevin. We're going to have more of a fuller discussion. But this would be a time where about 5 to 10 minutes where you can ask some clarifying questions. And then we'll break for refreshments and come back after that. So for that to happen, you can just stick up your hand or talk. I think we're in a small enough... Okay. Let's go with Michael first.
What was that poem that you referenced about?
The Cotter Saturday Night. Cotter, C-O-T-T-E-R, apostrophe S. Cotter is an old Scottish crop farmer. My wife actually is the daughter of a Scottish crofter. So it's very dear to our hearts as a poem. And it's a very beautiful description of family worship, which is odd because Burns was at some point the girl comes home with a new boyfriend and Burns waxes eloquent about, is there anybody wicked enough to seduce this girl and spoil her and ruin her and her parents' lives? And the answer, of course, is yes. His name's Robert Burns, because that's what he used to do. So it's always staggering to me that Burns was able to write this beautiful poem about poor religious people. And I think the key there is they were poor. He had this real sympathy for poor people. And their religion was a manifestation of their, it's kind of early romantic, I suppose, but a manifestation of their simplicity and authenticity. I just love the poem and love teaching it. Though Burns is a very interesting character himself.
More questions? And can you repeat the question when it's asked? Because I don't think we'll always hear.
I forgot.
Yep, at the back right there.
Carl, thank you for speaking tonight. I'm a member here at the church, and it's been a real pleasure to listen to you. I think that I missed the point, so I don't want to get hung up on it, so I'm not sure I have a complete question. But when you spoke about how the medieval peoples were tied to the land and the seasons, I think the point was that when you put them into a factory, you remove that cyclical anchor of seasons.
Yeah.
But if you're in a factory, and I've had the ability to both farm and work in a factory, but if you're in a factory, you're now even, it almost seems more slave to time.
Yeah.
And more anchored by a clock.
Yeah, and certainly Marx himself would have seen, I think, feudalism as by and large kinder to people than industrialism, but industrialism is a necessary stage before you get to the proletarian thing. I think the point, and you were correct that I missed this, I think what I was trying to get at there was experience of stability. Now, if you say, if, for example, we were to go to my Gloucestershire village in 1200, hang out for a few months, Time travel forward to 1300, hang out for a few months. Time travel forward to 1400 and hang out for a few months. Almost nothing would have changed. The rhythm of life would be the same. I moved to the States, I think around about August the 17th, 2001. Just a couple of weeks before 9/11, when it became very interesting to be a foreigner in a foreign country without pay. I got my visa, but that was it. But I would say you could leap in 5-year increments from 2001 to the present day, and every 5 years you would see more change than you saw between 1200 and 1400 in Gloucestershire. So I take your point. Yeah, in some ways we're more slaves to time now because we have clocks than they were in the Middle Ages. But that experience of the world as never changing, time never changing, that's something we don't have anymore. And you experience this yourself if you have an email account. It used to be when I first started as an academic over 30 years ago, most of my correspondence came in as letters, which was great because there wasn't very much of it. And then I remember somebody saying, hey, we're going to put everyone in an email and it'll be great because you'll be able to do your correspondence by 9 o'clock in the morning and get on with the rest of the day. It's not how it happened. My experience of time and time management was scrambled by the advent of email. Such now my problem is my wife might disagree with me, I'm kind of a kind-hearted guy. And if a student emails me at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, in desperation, I'm probably going to email them back. In the old days, they couldn't get hold of me. I could experience the weekend as a time of leisure, doing what I want to do. Now I can't do that anymore. So I was really thinking not so much about are we slaves to time, but how do we experience stability and how do we experience time?
I think we have time for one more question. So a short one. We've got 2 minutes here. Let's go right here.
In just thinking about the church and the stability that it provides, do you think one solution is sort of a reclamation of the liturgical calendar? Like, would that be one way that Christian families could sort of try to inculcate rhythms?
I hate to say this, but I wrote a thing against the liturgical calendar a few years ago, and every Lent somebody republishes it, and I've changed my mind. Yeah. I think that the liturgical calendar, first of all, I would put it this way. I don't think any church is sinning that does not follow a liturgical calendar. It is not necessary for the existence of the church. I think it can be helpful for the well-being of the church. And I do think a recapturing, for a number of reasons, of liturgical rhythm of time in the church could be very helpful. So I say that as a Presbyterian where, our liturgical calendar is first day of the week, that's the day. 52 weeks a year. But I've come to, maybe I've grown wiser or just less stupid. I don't know how to put it, but over the years, that's one of the things I've changed my mind on. That I've come to appreciate the stability and the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. As I've come to appreciate the stability and rhythm of not a detailed liturgy, but some formal liturgical structure in the Sunday service. I couldn't do I love the Book of Common Prayer. I couldn't do it every Sunday. It's just so much of it. But I do appreciate the logical, theological structure. So yes, I would say to any pastor here, that's something to think about. Maybe it won't work with your people. I don't think we need to have a one-size-fits-all. But maybe, given the issues you face in your church, maybe that would help. And seeing him over there, I do want to recommend Joe Minnick's book. A number of the things I've touched on today, I'm indebted to Joe Minnick for bringing to my attention through his book, Bulwarks of Unbelief. So I would recommend to anybody who wants to think more deeply about these things, Joe's work is excellent.